In the final months of 1942, the world stood at a turning point. Europe burned beneath the weight of Hitler's empire, and the Allies, Britain, the United States, and their partners searched for a way to strike back. The Soviet Union bled on the Eastern Front, demanding a second front to ease the pressure, but neither Britain nor America was yet ready for an invasion of France. So, in high-level war rooms from Washington to London, a compromise was reached. They would invade North Africa. It would be a proving ground, the place where America's young army would meet the veterans of the German Wehrmacht for the very first time. The plan was called Operation Torch, a bold amphibious landing along the coasts of French Morocco and Algeria. It was to be the first major American offensive of the war against Hitler's forces. Command of the operation fell to a man whose name would soon become legendary, Lieutenant General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Under him, British and American planners gathered fleets and divisions, shaping one of the most ambitious joint operations of the Second World War. In the early hours of November 8, 1942, the sea between Gibraltar and North Africa shimmered under the running lights of hundreds of Allied ships. The U.S. Army, many of its soldiers barely out of training camps, was about to enter combat for the first time. The landing stretched across three key points: Casablanca in the west, Oran in the center, and Algiers in the east. For the men aboard those ships, the war that had raged across the Atlantic for nearly 2 years was suddenly no longer distant. The rumble of naval guns, the smell of oil, and the anxious beating of hearts filled the decks. When the assault waves hit the beaches, they faced confusion rather than catastrophe. The defenders were not Germans, but Vichy French, fellow Europeans whose loyalties were divided. Some French units fired, others surrendered, and many simply waited to see who would win. In Algiers, political negotiations combined with swift British commando action secured the city in a day. Oran fell after short, fierce fighting, and at Casablanca, American tanks rolled into the city after naval bombardment silenced French guns. By the evening of November 11th, the Allies had seized all three landing zones. Operation Torch was a success, but the triumph was only the beginning. The real enemy, Rommel's Afrika Korps, was still hundreds of miles to the east in Tunisia and Libya. The Allied High Command quickly realized what had begun as a limited operation to occupy French colonies would become a major campaign against Germany itself. Eisenhower's orders were clear: advance east, link up with British 8th Army under General Montgomery, and crush the Axis in North Africa. For the Americans, this would be their first confrontation with the reality of modern war. Their divisions, the 1st Armored, the 1st Infantry, and others, were well-equipped but inexperienced. Their commanders were ambitious yet untested. Many soldiers still thought of war as something distant and almost romantic. They would soon learn otherwise. The march eastward across Algeria and into Tunisia was arduous. Rains turned the roads to rivers of mud, vehicles bogged down, and supply convoys stretched for miles. Along the way, the Americans encountered French villagers who greeted them with suspicion, and Bedouin herders who watched the strange columns of tanks and trucks roll by. It was a journey through a land of dust and endless horizon, where the mountains of the Atlas loomed like dark sentinels ahead. By late November 1942, U.S. mechanized columns began pushing toward the Tunisian frontier. Eisenhower hoped to reach the capital, Tunis, before the Axis could reinforce it. If Tunis fell quickly, the Germans would lose their last foothold in Africa. For a moment it seemed possible. American and British patrols advanced through the mountain passes, exchanging their first scattered shots with German reconnaissance units, but the window of opportunity was closing fast. Across the Mediterranean, Hitler had already moved. Convoys of transport planes and ships poured men and machines into Tunisia. The elite units of the Africa Corps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had survived their retreat from El Alamein and were now joining forces with newly arrived German divisions. By December, the Axis controlled much of Tunisia, building airfields, fortifications, and defensive lines. The Americans' race for Tunis had failed. Eisenhower soon realized that the fight ahead would not be the swift triumph he'd hoped for. The German army that now stood before him was no retreating rabble. It was battle-hardened, cunning, and deadly efficient. Rommel's men had fought the British for nearly 2 years, mastering desert warfare. They knew how to use terrain, concealment, and coordination between tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The Americans had yet to face such skill and precision. As 1943 began, the front lines in Tunisia solidified. The British held the north, the French held the centre, and the Americans, the newcomers, were assigned to the southern sector, near the vast rugged passes of the Atlas Mountains. The region was dry and unforgiving, dotted with rocky ridges, olive groves, and narrow defiles that twisted through the hills. There, the U.S. Second Corps, commanded by Major General Lloyd Fredendall, began digging in. His forces built defensive boxes around key passes, Faid, Sbiba, and Kasserine, their tanks and artillery hidden behind low hills, their infantry spread across long exposed fronts. To many, it seemed quiet, but Rommel was watching. To the Desert Fox, this newly arrived American army looked green and vulnerable, a soft flank he could exploit. As British pressure mounted in Libya, Rommel prepared one final gamble. He would strike through the passes, crush the Americans, and drive westward to capture their supply bases. It would be the first great clash between the United States and Nazi Germany. The Allied soldiers had no idea what awaited them. Many were still growing accustomed to the desert, the way dust coated every weapon, how water was rationed, and how a tank crew could roast alive under the Tunisian sun. Yet there was a sense of pride too. For the first time, the United States had taken the fight directly to Hitler's army. Letters home carried excitement and confidence. "We'll finish this quick," one GI wrote. "The Germans won't stand up to our armor." He was wrong, but he couldn't have known. In Algiers, Eisenhower worked tirelessly, coordinating British, American, and Free French units that didn't always trust one another. Political rivalries, logistical bottlenecks, and clashing egos made his job harder than any battle. Yet the advance continued. Convoys brought fuel, ammunition, and fresh troops from the west. The U.S. Army was learning the mechanics of global warfare on the fly, from shipping schedules to desert supply chains. Still, beneath the optimism, cracks were forming. Reports from reconnaissance pilots and French scouts spoke of German armoured movements gathering near Faid and Sidi Bouzid, but these warnings were often ignored or dismissed as exaggerated. Fredendall, cautious and somewhat aloof from his forward troops, underestimated the enemy's intent. By February 1943, the calm before the storm had settled over the mountains of western Tunisia. The Americans had reached their first true test, a clash not of numbers or machines, but of experience. On one side stood Rommel, a commander who had spent years perfecting desert warfare. On the other stood a young, untested American army, eager to prove itself. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the desert valleys and echo through history. The place would be Sidi Bouzid, and beyond it, the narrow defile known as Kasserine Pass, where the green soldiers of America would meet the veterans of Germany, and where both would learn the price of underestimating the other. By the dawn of 1943, the war in North Africa had entered a new and uncertain phase. The early triumph of Operation Torch had faded into a long, grinding struggle against an enemy that refused to yield. What had begun as a confident march eastward now became a battle of endurance through an unforgiving landscape, a land of heat, dust and deception, where every ridge concealed danger and every pass could become a trap. The Americans of Second Corps had reached Tunisia full of hope. The campaign ahead, they believed, would be their first great victory against Hitler's army. Yet as the winter rains turned the tracks to sludge, that optimism began to wear thin. Supply convoys bogged down in knee-deep mud, trucks sank to their axles, and tanks stalled halfway up steep passes. The men cursed the endless mud and the cold nights that followed each rainstorm. In the mornings, a thin frost coated the olive trees, and the wind carried the smell of diesel and damp earth across the hills. Eisenhower's command stretched from the coast to the southern ridges of the Atlas Mountains, where the Americans held a long, exposed front. The terrain was deceptive, rolling plains broken by sudden mountain spines and valleys that twisted like dry riverbeds. It was here that Rommel saw his chance. The German Field Marshal, now recovering from the retreat at El Alamein, had regrouped his battered Afrika Korps and received reinforcements, the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions, veterans of a dozen battles. To him, the Americans were an untested opponent, fresh and inexperienced. If he struck hard and fast, he could shatter them before they truly understood the kind of war they were in. Major General Lloyd Fredendall commanded the U.S. Second Corps. From his headquarters, dug deep into a wadi near Tebessa, he tried to manage 3 divisions spread over hundreds of miles. His defensive plan looked orderly on paper, a series of fortified boxes guarding key passes like Sbiba, Faid and Kasserine, but in reality his troops were too far apart to support one another. Each outpost was an island in a vast sea of sand. Officers complained that their radios were unreliable, and some units received orders days late. For the men on the front line, the war remained strangely quiet. Patrols moved cautiously through the hills, exchanging sporadic fire with German scouts. The Luftwaffe occasionally swept overhead, strafing convoys or dropping bombs on dusty supply dumps. Yet, despite the occasional air raid, there was little sense of an imminent German offensive. Many officers believed Rommel was on the defensive, worn down and short on supplies. That assumption would soon prove disastrous. While Eisenhower and his staff debated future offensives, Rommel was already laying his plans. He had no intention of sitting idle. German reconnaissance units mapped the American positions at Faid and Sidi Bou Zid, noting how poorly coordinated they were. At the same time, the Axis High Command ordered a counteroffensive to push the Allies back from Tunisia's heartland and secure the mountain passes before the British Eighth Army could link up from the east. Rommel's instincts told him that speed and surprise would be decisive. In early February 1943, the first signs of the coming storm appeared. American forward patrols reported seeing German armor moving west from Sfax. Intelligence officers passed the warnings up the chain of command, but Fredendall dismissed them, convinced the enemy lacked the fuel and strength to attack. He kept his main forces dispersed, insisting that his men hold their ground. Life in the American camps followed a restless rhythm. The soldiers dug slit trenches, built sandbag walls, and cleaned their rifles over and over. Dust coated every uniform, and the men joked that the desert was trying to bury them alive. They shared canned rations of beans and hard bread, washing them down with tepid water. Yet beneath the monotony, anxiety grew. Veterans of earlier skirmishes spoke of how the Germans fought, fast, precise, and deadly, and how their tanks seemed to appear from nowhere. Across the front, Rommel's forces were already gathering. In the south, his Italian divisions dug in along defensive lines near Mareth. Farther north, German armor assembled in the shadow of the Jebel Lesouda hills. Pilots of the Luftwaffe buzzed American positions, photographing tank parks and command posts. At night, Allied sentries could see faint lights flickering on the eastern horizon, the glow of German engines preparing to move. On February 10th, Rommel made his move. Under cover of darkness, his armoured columns began to advance westward. By dawn, dust clouds rose over the desert, and the sharp rattle of tank treads echoed off the rocky slopes. The first German attack fell upon the American outpost at Field Pass. US infantry there fought stubbornly, but their machine guns and light armour were no match for the panzers that bore down on them. Within hours, the defenders were pushed back, leaving behind burning half-tracks and scattered equipment. From his command post, Friedendahl received conflicting reports. One unit claimed the enemy was in full retreat, another said they were being overrun. Communication lines were jammed, radios broke down, and chaos spread across the front. The Americans had expected a probing raid, not a full-scale assault. As German forces surged forward, the desert erupted into a spectacle of fire and steel. The 21st Panzer Division cut across the plains toward Sidi Bouzid, while the 10th Panzer swept around from the south, forming a deadly pincer. American units on isolated hills were surrounded, their artillery firing desperately until ammunition ran dry. Tank crews tried to maneuver against the panzers, but the German 88mm guns tore through their armor. The sky filled with smoke and dust, and the sound of shells ricocheting across the ridges became a constant roar. The battle for Sidi Bouzid was short and brutal. By nightfall on February 14th, entire American battalions had been annihilated or captured. Those who escaped spoke in disbelief of how swiftly the Germans struck, appearing suddenly, hitting hard and vanishing before counterattacks could form. It was the kind of warfare Rommel had perfected, and the Americans were only beginning to comprehend it. As the German spearheads moved west, panic rippled through the rear areas. Supply convoys collided on narrow roads, and exhausted medics worked through the night, treating burns, shrapnel wounds, and concussions. In the nearby town of Sbeitler, columns of refugees, French civilians, local farmers, and retreating soldiers filled the streets. The sense of order that had defined the Allied advance after Operation Torch was gone. Yet amid the confusion, fragments of resistance began to form. Some American officers, refusing to surrender, rallied their men on nearby ridges. Artillery crews fired until their guns overheated. In one sector, a platoon of engineers set explosive charges on a bridge before pulling back, denying the Germans an easy route through the pass. These small acts of defiance did little to change the outcome, but they revealed a spirit that Rommel had not expected, a stubborn will to fight, even in defeat. By February 16th, the German advance had punched deep into the American sector. Rommel's columns now approached the western edge of the mountain range, eyeing the next objective, Kasserine Pass. The narrow defile cut through the mountains like a scar, offering a direct route into the Allied rear. If the Axis seized it, they could threaten the vital supply hubs at Tebessa and potentially split the Allied armies apart. That night, under a cold desert moon, American survivors gathered behind hastily dug positions at Kasserine. They were tired, angry, and shaken by the losses at Sidi Bouzid. Many had seen friends left behind on the battlefield, tanks burning like torches against the night sky. Yet in their exhaustion, a grim resolve took hold. They knew the Germans would come again, and this time the fight would decide far more than a few ridges or passes. Eisenhower, now fully aware of the scale of the German offensive, began rushing reinforcements toward the front. British armoured units moved north to support the Americans, while French troops attempted to hold key crossroads. Orders crackled over field radios through the night as headquarters tried to form a coherent line out of the remnants of shattered battalions. The next dawn brought an uneasy stillness. The wind carried the smell of burned fuel and scorched metal. Across the valley, faint glimmers of movement marked the approach of Rommel's spearhead. In the command tents, maps were spread out, coffee cups sat untouched, and every man present knew that the next battle would be decisive. The first true meeting between the United States Army and the German Wehrmacht had come at a terrible cost. Sidi Bou Zid was only the beginning. Ahead lay Kasserine, the narrow gateway through which both armies would soon pass, one in pursuit, the other struggling to hold the line. The lessons of that coming fight would be written in blood and fire, and they would change the course of America's war in North Africa forever. In the cold, early morning of February 14th, 1943, the winds that swept through the Tunisian desert carried more than just the sting of sand. They carried the sound of engines, deep, mechanical, and relentless. Across the flat plain east of Sidi Bou Zid, the horizon trembled as hundreds of German tanks and vehicles moved in unison, their dark silhouettes cutting across the rising sun. This was the day the American army would meet the full fury of the Wehrmacht for the first time. The Americans stationed around Sidi Bou Zid were largely unaware of the storm bearing down upon them. Most of them were from the U.S. 1st Armored Division and the 34th Infantry Division, young, untested, and eager to prove themselves. For days they had watched dust clouds in the east, assuming it was just enemy patrols or supply columns on the move. Even the reconnaissance reports that filtered back to headquarters described the movement as limited. No one yet realized that Rommel had unleashed his main attack. Sidi Bou Zid itself sat like a small oasis of human presence in a sea of stone. It was a cluster of mud brick buildings surrounded by rolling ridges, Jebel Lesouda to the west, Jebel Ksaira to the southeast, and Jebel Garret Hadid further beyond. These hills were the Americans' defensive positions. From their peaks, observers scanned the open plains, believing the terrain would give them time to spot any German approach. What they hadn't anticipated was the speed of the Afrika Korps. Just after dawn, the first artillery shells began to fall. The ground shook as the German 80s opened fire from beyond the ridgelines. Within minutes, the American radio network burst into life. Orders overlapped. Some commanders shouted for artillery to return fire. Others called for tank support. The desert erupted into chaos. From the east, the 10th Panzer Division advanced in a wedge formation, its panzers glinting under the morning light. From the south, the 21st Panzer Division swept in, creating a deadly pincer movement. In their foxholes on Jebel Lesouda, the men of the 168th Infantry watched in disbelief as lines of German armour approached faster than they thought possible. Sergeant James Morgan of Iowa later wrote in his diary that the tanks seemed to come out of the ground, rising from the desert itself. American anti-tank guns opened fire, but most shells bounced harmlessly off the thick armour of the leading panzers. The range was too great, the guns too light. Rommel's forces struck with precision born from years of desert warfare. The German tanks moved in coordinated groups, each supported by self-propelled artillery and mobile infantry. Stuka dive bombers screamed overhead, targeting American artillery batteries. Dust clouds rose so thick that many gunners could barely see what they were firing at. Within an hour, the entire plain had become a haze of smoke, sand, and metal. On the American side, confusion reigned. The forward battalions, isolated on the hills, tried to hold their ground, while armoured units from Sbeitler and Gafsa attempted to move forward to reinforce them. Communication between the units broke down almost immediately. The headquarters at Friedendall's rear position, a command post built deep inside a canyon miles from the front, had only fragmented reports to work with. One message claimed that the Germans were retreating. Another said they had broken through. Friedendall, cut off from the chaos, ordered his subordinates to hold their positions. It was an order that sealed the fate of many men that day. By mid-morning, the 10th Panzer Division had cut across the central plain, splitting the American line in two. German half-tracks carrying infantry fanned out across the valleys, encircling the hilltops. On Jebel Syra, Captain Robert Moore's company fought until its last rounds were spent. Surrounded on three sides, they tried to withdraw under the cover of smoke, but the panzers closed in quickly. One after another, the American tanks were picked off by 88mm shells that pierced through armor as if it were paper. Elsewhere, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Hightower of the 1st Armored Division led a counterattack with his M4 Sherman tanks. The Shermans were strong machines, but this was their first true trial against German armor. Hightower's tanks advanced bravely across the open ground and drove straight into a trap. From the flanks, concealed 88s opened fire. One tank after another burst into flames, black smoke curling into the desert sky. Hightower himself was wounded when his command tank was hit. The survivors retreated in disarray, their numbers shattered. As the sun climbed higher, Sidi Bou Zid was almost completely encircled. German infantry poured through the gaps between the hills, cutting off escape routes. American artillery batteries fought to the last, firing point-blank into advancing columns before being overrun. The air above the battlefield vibrated with the shriek of Stukas diving in, their sirens echoing off the mountains like a chorus of death. Every explosion sent fountains of dust skyward, and visibility dropped to near zero. Inside the besieged perimeter, wounded soldiers were carried into makeshift aid stations, schoolhouses, barns, anything with a roof. Medics worked in the dim light, their hands slick with blood and dust. Outside, the sound of engines and gunfire never ceased. The noise was constant, one survivor recalled later. You couldn't think, you could only react. By mid-afternoon, Rommel's trap was complete. Sidi Bou Zid was surrounded from every direction. The Americans on the outlying ridges were cut off entirely. Radio messages from Jebel Lesouda were filled with desperation. Ammunition gone, positions overrun, men running low on water. One by one, those transmissions went silent. In the valley below, the last armored vehicles of the 1st Armored Division tried to break through to rescue the trapped infantry. They charged across open ground, firing as they moved. For a brief moment, it seemed they might succeed. Then the German anti-tank guns opened up once more. The desert was littered with burning vehicles, their hulks still glowing red in the fading afternoon light. Rommel's command car arrived near the front late in the day. The Field Marshal stepped out, surveying the battlefield through binoculars. Around him, his officers reported the destruction of dozens of American tanks and the capture of hundreds of prisoners. The Afrika Korps had performed flawlessly, a textbook example of German combined arms tactics. Rommel knew, however, that this was only the first step. The Americans would fall back toward Kasserine Pass, and that narrow defile through the mountains could open the way to Algeria. His orders were simple: pursue without delay. As night fell, the battlefield lay silent except for the crackle of fires and the groans of the wounded. The smell of oil and scorched metal hung heavy in the air. Columns of prisoners were marched east under guard, their faces blank with shock. For many, it had been their first battle, and it had ended in utter collapse. In the American rear areas, the news spread slowly and unevenly. Commanders tried to make sense of conflicting reports, while engineers rushed to fortify the next line of defense. At Tebessa, Eisenhower received word of the disaster and immediately ordered reinforcements toward the front. He also sent a message to Fredendall: hold the next position at all costs. For the survivors of Sidi Bou Zid, the retreat westward was a nightmare. Convoys of trucks and jeeps choked the narrow roads. German aircraft strafed the columns, forcing drivers to scatter into the ditches. Behind them, the once quiet valley burned. a vision of destruction that would haunt those who escaped it. The battle for Sidi Bou Zid had lasted barely 48 hours, yet its consequences were immense. More than 2,000 Americans were dead, wounded, or captured. Dozens of tanks and vehicles were lost. The morale of Second Corps was shattered. In experience and confidence, the German army had proven itself a formidable adversary. For the Americans, it was a harsh initiation into the realities of modern warfare. But amid the wreckage, lessons began to form. The survivors who regrouped west of Spitler spoke bitterly of poor communication, flawed leadership, and scattered defences. They also spoke of courage, of artillerymen who refused to abandon their guns, of infantry who held out until their ammunition was gone, of medics who stayed behind to tend to the wounded. These fragments of resilience would carry forward into the battles yet to come. As Rommel's panzers moved west through the mountain passes, the US Army reeled from its first true confrontation with the Wehrmacht. The Germans had drawn blood, and the Americans had been humbled. Yet the campaign was far from over. Ahead lay Kasserine Pass, a narrow gateway where the fate of the Allied line in Tunisia would be decided. The wreckage of Sidi Bou Zid still smouldered when Rommel set his next move into motion. The Field Marshal, ever restless, studied his maps beneath the flickering lamplight of his command tent. American forces had been mauled and forced west, their confidence shattered, their lines fractured. The road to the interior of Algeria now lay open through the rugged mountains of western Tunisia, a single narrow route known as Kasserine Pass. To Rommel, this was an opportunity as dangerous as it was tempting. A deep thrust through the pass could split the Allies in two and threaten their entire position in North Africa. If executed swiftly, it might even drive them back toward the sea. For the men of the US Second Corps, the retreat westward was an ordeal of exhaustion and disbelief. The survivors of Sidi Bou Zid stumbled into their new positions around Kasserine, their faces hollowed by dust and sleepless nights. Trucks rolled in laden with ammunition, rations, and the wounded. Engineers worked feverishly, laying mines and wiring makeshift defences across the mountain slopes. Yet for all the frantic preparation, there was little sense of unity. The Allied line was a patchwork of nationalities. Americans holding the centre, French colonial troops covering the southern approaches, and British armoured brigades arriving from the north. Command was fragmented, coordination tenuous. Each unit waited for orders that came too late or contradicted those already given. The geography of Kasserine was as treacherous as any enemy. The pass itself cut through the dorsal mountains, a twisting, steep-walled corridor barely a mile wide at its narrowest. Jagged ridges rose on either side, offering commanding views to whoever held them. In the surrounding valleys, olive trees and dry riverbeds broke the landscape into uneven patches of concealment. For the Americans, the terrain was alien and unsettling. For Rommel, it was perfect, a place where experience and deception could turn the tide of an entire campaign. In the early hours of February 19th, 1943, the stillness was broken by the thunder of German guns. The 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions surged forward once more, supported by Italian Bersaglieri and mechanized infantry. Their artillery, positioned high on the eastern ridges, opened up with devastating accuracy. Shells screamed overhead and burst along the American line, sending men diving into foxholes. From the rear, the silhouettes of tanks moved like phantoms through the haze. The attack was underway. On the forward slopes, US troops clung to their positions. The 19th Combat Engineer Battalion manned the approaches to the pass, while scattered units of the 1st Armoured Division provided mobile support. The air buzzed with the rattle of machine guns and the boom of tank cannons. In one sector, Captain John Waters, son-in-law of General Patton, led his company in a desperate defence, repositioning tanks along the ridgeline as German armor advanced. He was soon surrounded. His radio operator recalled the eerie calm in Waters' voice before the line went dead. German infantry followed closely behind their tanks, moving in disciplined waves. They advanced through the dust clouds, firing in short bursts, using every contour of the land for cover. The Americans responded with determination, their artillery thundering from the rear slopes, sending up columns of flame and smoke. Yet the German push continued, relentless and coordinated. The Luftwaffe swept over the battlefield in screaming dives, Stukas plunging toward their targets with precision honed by years of practice. The ground shook beneath the weight of the bombardment, and every ridge seemed alive with fire. By mid-morning, Rommel's assault began to find its rhythm. His panzers probed for weaknesses, feinting at one flank before driving into another. The Americans, still recovering from the chaos of earlier defeats, struggled to form a coherent defense. Units that had never fought together before now shared the same foxholes. Orders came through garbled or incomplete. One battalion, believing itself outflanked, withdrew without warning, opening a gap through which German tanks poured. The pass that had been a defensive line only hours earlier now threatened to become an open door. Rommel observed the battle from a hill overlooking the valley. His binoculars traced the movements of his armoured columns as they advanced, the black crosses on their hulls stark against the ochre desert. To his left, Italian units pressed along the southern route toward Ferriana, while to his right, the 10th Panzer Division aimed directly at the heart of the pass. Satisfied, he gave the order for a full breakthrough. His voice, calm and clipped, betrayed no doubt. Drive them from the mountains, seize the road to Tebessa. The American defenders at the center fought with grim determination. Artillery batteries from the 33rd Field Artillery Regiment fired until their barrels glowed red. Machine gun teams, entrenched among the rocks, mowed down advancing infantry until they were overrun. In one fierce engagement, a platoon from the 26th Infantry managed to knock out 3 panzers using a combination of anti-tank mines and grenades hurled from behind boulders. Yet such moments of defiance were fleeting. The German onslaught was too coordinated, too practiced. By late afternoon, the situation had deteriorated beyond control. Rommel's tanks had forced their way through the narrow gorge, crushing the American forward positions and scattering what remained of the defenders. Trucks laden with ammunition and wounded men raced westward under constant air attack. The roads were clogged with retreating vehicles, some overturned, others burning. At one crossroads, an American officer was seen standing atop a jeep, waving a pistol and shouting at drivers to turn and fight. Few heard him over the roar of engines and the chaos of retreat. The 6th Armoured Division of the British Army, holding the northern flank, moved to stem the tide. Their Crusader and Sherman tanks engaged the German spearhead in a series of brutal exchanges, trading shot for shot across the barren plain. For hours, the two sides battled at close range until the setting sun cast long shadows across the wreckage. When darkness fell, the British withdrew in good order, having delayed the enemy long enough for the Americans to regroup further west. As night settled over Kasserine, the battlefield was a vision of desolation. Burning wrecks littered the valley floor. The cries of the wounded mingled with the hiss of escaping fuel and the crackle of fire. The air reeked of cordite and smoke. Somewhere among the debris, Rommel's staff car rolled slowly forward, its headlights dimmed. The Field Marshal stepped out, his boots crunching on shattered shell casings. He surveyed the scene through weary eyes. Victory was his, though incomplete. The Americans had been driven back, but they were not destroyed. The pass was open, yet the prize beyond it remained uncertain. In the Allied rear, Eisenhower's headquarters buzzed with urgency. Reports flowed in. Fragments of radio transmissions, incomplete casualty figures, calls for reinforcements. The scale of the German offensive was now undeniable. Eisenhower ordered every available unit to move toward Kasserine. British reserves under General Anderson began to form a secondary line near Thala, while French units took up blocking positions to the south. For the first time since landing in North Africa, the Allies faced the real possibility of a catastrophic defeat. Rommel, meanwhile, faced his own limitations. His supply lines were stretched thin, fuel was running low, and his men were exhausted after weeks of continuous fighting. The original plan had been to strike swiftly, but delays and terrain had cost him precious time. He could see the hesitation in the faces of his subordinates, officers who knew that every mile deeper into the mountains meant another mile away from safety. Still, he pressed on, convinced that momentum was his greatest weapon. At dawn on February 20th, the Axis forces renewed their attack. German and Italian columns advanced through Kasserine, engaging the remnants of American resistance west of the pass. Yet this time, the defenders fought with a newfound resilience. Fresh artillery units from the U.S. 9th Infantry Division had arrived overnight, and their guns thundered with precision. Shells exploded among the advancing armor, tearing open columns and forcing the panzers to scatter. Allied aircraft, British Spitfires and American Warhawks swooped in to strafe enemy vehicles, the sky alive with the thunder of engines. The battle raged through the day, a furious contest of will and endurance. Slowly the German momentum faltered. What began as a breakthrough devolved into grinding attrition. Rommel realized that his offensive, though spectacular, was running out of steam. The Americans were bloodied but learning fast, adapting under fire. The Field Marshal weighed his choices carefully as dusk fell once more. He had achieved surprise and inflicted heavy losses, but the Allied line had not collapsed. The next move would determine whether his gamble in the Tunisian mountains would end in triumph or retreat. As the sun disappeared behind the jagged peaks, Rommel issued new orders to regroup for the night. His men, hardened veterans, dug into the rocky ground and waited for the dawn that would decide their fate. In the darkness beyond the pass, the Americans prepared for their counterstrike. The desert had swallowed the screams of battle, leaving only the low hum of engines and the restless whisper of the wind through the mountains. The fight for Kasserine was far from over. What began as a rout was transforming into a test of resolve, a struggle that would decide who truly commanded the deserts of North Africa. When dawn broke on February 21st, 1943, the mountains around Kasserine were still wreathed in smoke. The smell of burned oil hung heavy in the air, carried by a cold desert wind that swept over the shattered ridges. Across the scarred valley floor, the silhouettes of destroyed tanks stood like monuments to the chaos of the previous days. Rommel's forces had advanced deep into the American lines, but the fury of the offensive was beginning to wane. His columns had stretched themselves across miles of treacherous terrain, their fuel reserves dwindling, their crews exhausted. The Americans were bleeding, yet they were still there, regrouping, reinforcing, preparing to strike back. In the Allied camps west of the pass, a transformation was taking place. Fresh artillery batteries from the U.S. 9th Infantry Division arrived through the night, their trucks grinding through the mountain tracks with headlights blacked out. British reinforcements from General Anderson's First Army moved into position near Thala, bringing with them Sherman tanks and the hard-earned experience of years of desert warfare. Among the American troops, a new tone of determination replaced the disarray that had haunted the earlier battles. The soldiers who had fled Sidi Bou Zid and Kasserine now spoke with quiet resolve. They had seen the worst and survived it. Now they intended to fight back. General Eisenhower had spent the night coordinating the counterattack from his headquarters in Constantine. His orders were direct and uncompromising: hold the line at all costs, regroup the scattered units, and deny Rommel any further advance. To carry this out, the Americans reorganized under new leadership. Brigadier General Paul Robinett took command of the battered 1st Armoured Division remnants, while British Major General Ivor Anderson deployed his units to block the northern approaches. The line forming near Thala and Jebel el Hamra was to become the hinge upon which the entire Tunisian campaign would turn. Rommel, meanwhile, pressed on despite his army's exhaustion. His plan was audacious: drive through Thala, capture Tebessa, and cut off Allied supply lines entirely. Yet by the morning of the 21st, he was already operating on borrowed time. His panzers, short of fuel and ammunition, relied on scavenged Allied supplies. Even his vaunted Africa Corps was beginning to feel the strain of endless movement through the rough mountain terrain. Still he advanced. To retreat without victory would mean conceding the initiative to the Allies once more. The first clashes of the new day came on the approaches to Jebel el Hamra. American forward observers spotted German columns moving through the mist, their outlines faint against the pale light. At 0900 hours, US artillery opened fire. Shells rained down across the valley, bursting among the lead vehicles of the 10th Panzer Division. For the first time in the campaign, American gunners had the range exactly right. The ground shook with the rhythm of coordinated barrages, and when the smoke cleared, several German tanks lay crippled and burning. Encouraged, the defenders redoubled their efforts. On the slopes overlooking Thala, British units took up defensive positions. The 26th Armoured Brigade deployed in depth, covering the road with overlapping fields of fire. To their south, the remnants of the US 1st Armoured Division began to reform. Their surviving tanks dug in hull down behind the ridge lines. Engineers worked without pause, laying mines and fortifying choke points. Every man knew what was at stake. If the line broke here, the road to Algeria would be open, and the entire Allied front in Tunisia could unravel. Rommel's assault came in waves. The first German tanks advanced cautiously, their guns firing as they moved. Behind them, infantry in half-tracks dismounted and spread out, taking cover among the boulders. Overhead, the Luftwaffe appeared again, Stukas diving through the cloud cover to strike at the Allied artillery positions. But this time, the defenders were ready. Anti-aircraft guns barked from the valley floor, and tracer fire streaked through the sky. Several of the attacking aircraft went down in flames, their wreckage scattering across the hillsides. By midday, the Germans were fully engaged along the Thala line. For the Americans, it was the most organized battle they had fought since arriving in Tunisia. Communications worked, artillery coordination was tight, and supply trucks managed to bring forward ammunition under constant fire. The defensive line held firm. Rommel, observing from his command car, could see that the energy of his offensive was fading. The enemy had learned quickly, adapting their tactics with startling speed. As afternoon stretched into evening, the desert echoed with the thunder of a duel between armor and artillery. Sherman tanks of the 1st Armoured Division engaged the panzers head-on, trading fire at close range. Every hit sent plumes of dust and flame skyward. The battlefield was a panorama of noise, shells exploding, engines roaring, men shouting through the din. The heat from burning vehicles shimmered across the plain, turning the air into a distorted haze. Amid this chaos, acts of courage unfolded quietly and without witness. A squad of American engineers, cut off from their unit, held a bridge under machine gun fire long enough for retreating vehicles to cross. British medics crawled across open ground to drag wounded soldiers to safety. In one sector, an artillery forward observer kept directing fire until the very moment his position was overrun, his last transmission guiding a barrage that shattered the leading wave of enemy armor. By nightfall, Rommel's spearheads had failed to break the line. His attack on Thala had ground to a halt under relentless Allied fire. To the south, his Italian divisions fared no better. The combined effect of airstrikes, accurate artillery, and stubborn infantry defense blunted their momentum entirely. Rommel, ever pragmatic, ordered a temporary withdrawal to reorganize. His staff protested, arguing that to stop now was to lose the advantage. He ignored them. The offensive had reached its limit. That night, the Allied commanders met amid the flickering lanterns of their makeshift headquarters. Eisenhower's reports from the front were cautious but hopeful. "They are holding," one British liaison officer told him. "The Americans have steadied themselves." It was true. For the first time in Tunisia, the US Army had faced the full weight of a German offensive and had refused to yield. The lessons of Sidi Bou Zid and Kasserine were taking root, transforming panic into discipline. The following day, February the 22nd, the Allies seized the initiative. Reinforced by British artillery and fresh American infantry, they launched a series of counterattacks along the length of the front. Waves of shells pounded German positions, and fighter bombers prowled the skies, strafing columns caught in the open. On the ground, Allied tanks advanced methodically, supported by infantry who moved from cover to cover with growing confidence. The German lines, already stretched, began to waver. Rommel's commanders reported rising casualties and dwindling ammunition. His vehicles were running low on fuel, forcing many to be abandoned along the roadside. Even so, the Field Marshal maintained his composure. He knew the moment had passed. His strike through Kasserine had shocked the Americans, but the element of surprise was gone. The Allies were now fighting as a cohesive force, coordinated, supplied, and relentless. To press further would be suicide. By the afternoon of February 23rd, the order was given to withdraw. The 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions began pulling back through the passes they had so recently conquered. The Americans pursued cautiously, wary of traps. The ground they advanced across was littered with the remnants of battle, burned-out tanks, shattered artillery, and discarded helmets half buried in sand. The sense of relief among the Allied troops was immense. They had survived Rommel's best blow and forced him to retreat. For Eisenhower, the victory at Kasserine's edge was more than tactical. It was psychological. His army had endured humiliation and loss, yet within days had rebounded to hold the line and strike back. The transformation from chaos to competence had come at a terrible cost, but it had come nonetheless. The veterans of those days would later say that Kasserine was the crucible in which the modern American army was forged. As darkness fell on February the 24th, the sound of gunfire faded into the distance. The mountains that had echoed with battle for 10 days were silent once again. Across the valleys, Allied troops set to work gathering the wounded, burying the dead, and salvaging what equipment they could. In their faces was exhaustion, but also pride. They had faced Rommel's legend, the Desert Fox himself, and lived to tell of it. Rommel's army, retreating eastward toward the Mareth Line, left behind its first taste of failure in North Africa. For the Americans, the counterattack at Kasserine marked the moment the tide began to turn. The lessons learned there would shape every battle that followed, from the deserts of Tunisia to the hedgerows of Normandy. When the last guns fell silent in the valleys of western Tunisia, the men who had fought at Kasserine Pass stood among ruins that spoke more powerfully than any report or communique. Burned-out tanks smouldered beside twisted trucks. The charred wrecks of half-tracks marked the roads where convoys had been ambushed. In the desert wind, torn maps, letters, and ration tins drifted between the rocks. For the soldiers of the US Second Corps, the campaign that had begun with optimism now lay buried beneath the dust of experience. The scale of the losses was sobering. Over 6,000 American casualties had been recorded, hundreds of vehicles lost, and large quantities of equipment destroyed or captured. The exact figures took weeks to confirm, but the sight of rows of stretchers and wrecked armor told its own truth. The men of the Africa Corps, too, had suffered heavily, losing valuable tanks, fuel, and seasoned crews they could ill afford to replace. Both sides staggered away from Kasserine, knowing that the battle had changed them. For Rommel, the failure to break through to Tebessa marked the end of his bold offensive in Tunisia. His army, stretched thin and running on fumes, fell back toward the Mareth line to prepare for the next confrontation with the British Eighth Army advancing from Libya. The Field Marshal, whose reputation as the Desert Fox had grown through years of daring victories, faced a bitter reality. His enemy had learned his methods. The American army, though bloodied, was no longer the green force he had met 2 weeks earlier. They were beginning to understand how to fight in the desert, how to coordinate, how to endure, and how to adapt. As Rommel withdrew, the Allied commanders gathered to assess what had gone wrong and what had gone right. At the headquarters in Constantine, Eisenhower listened as reports poured in. The losses were serious, yet the overall campaign was intact. The front had held. In the end, the Germans had advanced no farther than they had started. The tone in his headquarters was no longer despairing, but analytical. The Americans had been caught unprepared for the scale and speed of Rommel's assault, but they had recovered quickly, learning under fire. That capacity to learn, Eisenhower realized, would define the battles to come. General Friedendahl, who had commanded Second Corps throughout the disaster, did not survive the aftermath of Kasserine in command. His isolated headquarters dug miles from the front, and his failure to coordinate the defense had become symbols of a larger issue: inexperience at the highest levels. Eisenhower, though reluctant to humiliate a fellow officer, knew change was essential. Within weeks, Friedendahl was relieved. His replacement would be a man whose name would soon echo across battlefields from Tunisia to Europe: General George S. Patton. Patton arrived like a thunderstorm over the weary Second Corps. He walked the lines, inspecting weapons, berating sloppiness, and demanding the discipline that the army had lacked. Helmets were to be worn at all times. Uniforms had to be kept clean. Units were to move with precision, no matter the conditions. Behind the bluster lay a fierce determination to forge the chaos of Kasserine into steel. The lesson of this battle, he told his officers, is paid for in blood. We won't pay that price again. His men, still shaken from defeat, found in his fury something they had been missing: conviction. While the Americans reorganized, the British High Command studied the campaign closely. General Anderson and his staff concluded that the mixed command structure in Tunisia had crippled their response to Rommel's thrust. Too many national commands, too many overlapping orders. In the weeks that followed, Eisenhower moved to unify control under a single Allied headquarters. The result was the formation of the 18th Army Group, a combined command bringing British, American, and Free French forces under one strategic direction. The lessons of Kasserine were already reshaping how the Allies fought together. On the ground, the soldiers carried their own understanding forward. Tank crews who had survived the maelstrom now drilled in gunnery and coordination, learning to fight in units rather than scattered platoons. Infantry companies were retrained to use the terrain more effectively, digging in deeper and coordinating with artillery in ways they had once ignored. The bitter experiences of Faid, Sidi Bouzid, and Kasserine became classroom studies in what not to repeat. The men who had run under bombardment now learned to stand fast behind fortifications of their own making. The psychological shift was profound. The fear that had haunted the Americans in their first encounters with Rommel's veterans was giving way to resolve. Letters home reflected the change. "We've seen what they can do," one soldier wrote to his family in Illinois, and now we know how to stop them. The air of invincibility that had surrounded the Afrika Korps for so long had been dented. The Germans had won the tactical engagements, but they had lost the greater advantage of shock. Eisenhower himself emerged from the ordeal more assured. The battle had tested his leadership as supreme commander of Allied forces in North Africa. He had seen the flaws in coordination, the friction between national contingents, and the weaknesses in command. He addressed each systematically. New supply chains were organized to support the coming offensive. Air-ground communication was improved, training intensified. The next time the Americans went into battle, they would do so as part of a disciplined, integrated, Allied machine. Rommel's own reflections on the campaign were recorded in dispatches later studied by both sides. He acknowledged the bravery of the American soldiers and the rapid pace of their improvement. "The young army fought with courage," he wrote. "Their generals will learn quickly." Yet his admiration was tinged with frustration. The lack of supplies and the failure of the Axis High Command to reinforce Tunisia had doomed his plans. Within weeks, he would be recalled to Germany, his health failing and his forces left to fight on without him. The Desert Fox's campaign in Africa was nearing its end. In the months that followed, the ripples from Kasserine reached far beyond the desert. The American press initially reported the battle as a setback, sparking public anxiety at home. But as news emerged of the counterattack and Rommel's retreat, the story shifted. Kasserine was reframed as a hard-earned lesson, the moment when the United States Army found its footing in a global war. Eisenhower, in his later writings, described it as the crucible from which an army of amateurs began to turn professional. The transformation became evident in the next phase of the North African campaign. When the Allies launched their final offensive in Tunisia 2 months later, the difference was striking. The coordination between American and British units was seamless. Artillery and air power worked in concert, and logistics flowed smoothly across the front. The victory at the Battle of El Guettar in late March, where Patton's Second Corps repelled another German armoured attack, bore the unmistakable mark of lessons learned at Kasserine. For the men who had fought through that ordeal, the desert would always carry memories of both humiliation and redemption. In the evenings after the battle, soldiers gathered around campfires under the clear North African sky, speaking quietly of comrades lost and of what they had endured. Many were too tired for bitterness. They cleaned their weapons, tended their vehicles, and prepared for the next march. There was a sense that they had crossed an invisible line, from naivete into hard-earned professionalism. The Tunisian campaign continued through the spring of 1943, ending with the Axis surrender in May. Yet even after victory, veterans of Kasserine rarely spoke of triumph. To them it remained a scar, a reminder of what it took to learn the cost of war. Those who survived would later fight across Sicily, Italy, and Normandy, carrying the memory of that first desperate stand in the mountains of Tunisia. Historians would come to describe Kasserine Pass as both a defeat and a turning point. For the Germans, it was the last time the Afrika Korps held the initiative in North Africa. For the Americans, it was the first step toward mastery of modern warfare. The mistakes made there would never be repeated on such a scale. From the smoke and confusion of that narrow pass emerged an army tempered by failure, guided by new leadership, and ready for the long road to victory. As the sun set over the Tunisian highlands in the days after the battle, the desert returned to its eerie silence. The wind swept across the sand, erasing the tracks of tanks and the footprints of men. Yet beneath that silence lay the memory of transformation, the moment when an inexperienced force became something far greater. The ghosts of Kasserine remained, whispering lessons that would echo through the campaigns that followed, all the way to the final battles of Europe.